In May 1940, the British Isles became the site of a profound military anomaly. Following the chaotic evacuation at Dunkirk, the British Army, the primary land force of a global empire, effectively ceased to exist as a mechanized entity. On paper, they were a modern military. In reality, they had left 2,500 heavy guns, 64,000 vehicles, and nearly every modern anti-tank weapon they possessed in the sand and surf of France. Across the English Channel, the German High Command was finalizing Operation Sea Lion. They possessed 3,000 panzer tanks, coordinated by a doctrine of speed and armor that had just dismantled the French and Polish armies in weeks. To meet them, the British Home Guard, a civilian militia of bakers, shopkeepers, and retired veterans, prepared to defend the coast. However, a survey of their armory revealed a terrifying vacuum. In some sectors, the last line of defense was armed with nothing more than fowling pieces, pitchforks, and golf clubs. The physical contradiction of the summer of 1940 was this. A nation was preparing to stop a steel blitzkrieg with civilian resolve, yet they lacked the basic physics to pierce a single centimeter of German armor. The standard military response to a tank is an anti-tank gun, a complex, expensive, and heavy piece of industrial machinery. Britain had none. Consequently, the government turned to a solution that defied every established convention of ordnance. It was a weapon that looked like a common household object. It was fragile, made of glass, and encased in a substance so volatile that the military establishment viewed it with more fear than the panzers themselves. This artifact was the No. 74 anti-tank grenade, better known as the sticky bomb. It was a weapon born from a singular, terrifying question. How do you destroy a Panzer IV when you have no gun, no range, and no hope of survival if you fail? The answer was found in a glass sphere filled with nitroglycerin and coated in a birdlime adhesive so powerful it could not be touched by the person wielding it. This investigation is a study of the geometry of desperation. It is the story of how a nation's fear transformed a ridiculed, flawed, and arguably suicidal invention into a weapon of last resort, the only thing standing between a civilian population and the most efficient killing machine of the 20th century. The sticky bomb was a symbol of a nation that had run out of options. Nevertheless, as the first crates began to arrive at village halls across England, the volunteers realized that the greatest danger was not the German tank in front of them, but the glass bottle currently in their hands. The existential dread of 1940 created a unique administrative vacuum in London. While the War Office remained paralyzed by the loss of their heavy equipment, a small rogue cell of engineers and outliers began to operate outside the traditional chain of command. This unit was officially designated Ministry of Defence 1, MD1. In the halls of the military establishment, however, it was dismissed with a patronizing nickname, Churchill's Toy Shop. The toy shop was established in a requisitioned country house, away from the prying eyes of the regular army. Its mandate was to ignore the decades of bureaucratic red tape that governed weapon development. The crisis required tools that could be manufactured in weeks, not years, using materials that were not yet rationed. This necessitated a shift from high-grade military steel to the mundane, glass, fabric, and industrial glue. At the center of this frantic innovation was Major Millis Jefferies. He was an officer who viewed the German Panzer as a problem of structural engineering. Jefferies recognized a fundamental vulnerability in armored warfare. No matter how thick the frontal plating of a tank is, the machine is inherently a box of thin-skinned vulnerabilities on its sides, its rear, and its engine deck. Nevertheless, the problem remained one of delivery. A standard grenade would bounce off the sloped armor of a Panzer before detonating, dissipating its energy into the open air. To kill a tank, the explosive force must be coupled directly to the steel. The geometry of the kill required the charge to be perfectly stationary against the hull. Jefferies's vision was radical because it was so crude. He proposed a weapon that used a glass sphere as a reservoir for a high-explosive gel. By encasing this sphere in a high-strength adhesive, he bypassed the need for magnets, which were in short supply, or complex mechanical clamps. Despite the elegance of the logic, the proposal horrified traditional ordnance officers. They were used to weapons that were stable, safe to transport, and predictable. Moreover, the toy shop operated under the direct protection of the Prime Minister. Churchill understood that the regular army was too slow to adapt to the reality of an invasion. He needed a people's weapon, something that a baker in Kent could use to disable a 20-ton machine. Consequently, MD1 was given the resources to turn Jeffress's glass sphere into a reality. The sticky bomb was born as the byproduct of a nation that had been stripped of its traditional defenses. It was a weapon of the underdog, designed by an inventor who believed that if you couldn't shoot a tank from a mile away, you had to be willing to walk up and touch it. The design of the No. 74 grenade was a masterpiece of mid-century improvisation, centered on a physical artifact that seemed better suited to a laboratory than a trench. It was a spherical glass flask, roughly the size of a large grapefruit. This choice was made primarily for the specific properties of fragmentation and weight. Glass is brittle. It shatters predictably upon impact, ensuring that the contents are immediately released against the target. Inside this sphere sat the punch of the weapon, 560 grams of Nobel's 823, a high-explosive gel based on nitroglycerin, possessing a consistency similar to thick petroleum jelly. It was powerful, but its true utility lay in its stability when compressed. To make this sphere effective against a moving wall of steel, Jeffress had to solve the problem of adhesion. He wrapped the glass in a stockinette fabric, essentially a heavy-duty wool sock, and saturated it in a proprietary industrial-grade birdlime. This adhesive was the heart of the invention. It was so aggressive that it could bond to greasy, dusty, or wet metal in a fraction of a second. Nevertheless, this created a secondary engineering crisis. How do you transport a bomb that sticks to everything it touches? Jeffress's solution was a two-part protective clamshell. The sticky sphere was encased in two thin metal hemispheres, held together by a spring-loaded handle and a safety pin. The weapon also featured a dual safety mechanism. The user would pull the first pin to jettison the metal casing, exposing the glue-soaked fabric. Only then would they pull a second pin to arm the 5-second internal fuse. The narrative of its creation is anchored to a single realization by Jeffress. A soldier does not need a cannon if they have the science of the stick. If the explosive could be held flush against the armor, the resulting blast would create a scab of steel on the inside of the tank. This effect, known as Hopkinson pressure, turns the tank's own armor into shrapnel that ricochets through the interior. By utilizing a glass sphere, Jeffress ensured that the bomb was cheap enough to be manufactured by any commercial bottling plant in the United Kingdom. As a consequence, the weapon was not a burden on the heavy industrial factories already overwhelmed by the RAF's needs. It was an everyman's bomb. Despite the technical logic, the first time the military board saw the prototype, they saw a suicide device. The very adhesive that made it effective against the enemy was about to become a fatal flaw for the men tasked with carrying it. The adhesive, the very genius of Jeffress's design, also introduced its most terrifying flaw. While perfectly effective at bonding to tank armor, the industrial-grade birdlime covering the glass sphere was indiscriminately effective. It stuck to everything. The design assumed a perfect execution. The user would pull the first pin, the metal casing would drop cleanly away, and the sticky sphere would be immediately slapped onto the enemy tank. Yet, in the chaos of combat, or even in the stress of training, such precision was a luxury. If the bomb was fumbled, or if the user's hand brushed the exposed adhesive, the consequences were immediate and often fatal. The glue-soaked fabric would bond to skin, uniform, or even the ground. With the second safety pin already pulled, the fuse was armed, and the clock was ticking down to a 5-second detonation. This inherent danger led to an immediate and derisive wave of nicknames within the military. It was called the clammy clam, a reference to its sticky, uncooperative nature. More ominously, it was often referred to as the bomb that sticks to you. These were expressions of very real terror. The skepticism from the military establishment was palpable and immediate. General Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, was famously quoted as stating, "It is a most dangerous weapon to the user, and I would not touch it with a barge pole." This quote encapsulates the prevailing attitude. Traditional military doctrine prioritized the safety of the soldier as much as the lethality of the weapon. A device that was as likely to kill its wielder as its target was anathema. The resistance to the sticky bomb was not simply about its clumsiness, it was about the fundamental disruption it represented. For decades, military ordnance had moved towards greater precision and improved safety mechanisms. Jeffress's bomb was a step backward, a return to the crude, dangerous implements of earlier wars. Military officers preferred to do nothing rather than risk deploying a weapon that demanded such a terrifying psychological contract from its user. They argued for patience, for the production of proper anti-tank guns, despite the undeniable reality that those guns simply did not exist. Therefore, the sticky bomb became a symbol of Britain's desperation. It was a weapon that dared the user to accept a terrifying gamble, their life for the life of a tank. The flaw was so pronounced, the danger so inherent, that it threatened to prevent the bomb from ever reaching the hands of the Home Guard, yet the stakes of the impending invasion were too high for bureaucracy to win. The bureaucratic gridlock surrounding the No. 74 grenade reached a breaking point in the summer of 1940. The Ordnance Board, horrified by the sticky bomb's tendency to adhere to the thrower's trousers, officially rejected the weapon. They viewed it as a liability that would demoralize the Home Guard. To them, a soldier with a pitchfork was better than a soldier who accidentally blew himself up in a trench. However, the military establishment had not accounted for the specific temperament of Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister had a well-known affinity for the toy shop and its unorthodox inventions. While his generals saw a dangerous hazard, Churchill saw a psychological equalizer. He understood that in a total war, the mere existence of a weapon, no matter how flawed, could shift the morale of an entire nation. When Churchill learned that the sticky bomb was being blocked by the War Office, he bypassed the entire chain of command. On a brief, decisive minute, he issued a directive that would become legendary in the history of British ordnance. He wrote, "Sticky bomb. Make 1 million." This was not a request. It was a political mandate that steamrolled over every safety concern raised by the generals. Churchill recognized that the Home Guard needed more than just resolve. They needed to believe they were being armed by a government that was as desperate and defiant as they were. By ordering 1 million units, he turned a laboratory experiment into a national priority. The impact of this order was immediate. Production shifted into high gear, utilizing non-traditional manufacturing streams. Because the bomb used glass and fabric rather than specialized alloy, it could be produced in civilian workshops across the country. Eventually, the total production surpassed 5 million units. Yet Churchill's championing of the bomb wasn't based on a delusion that it was a perfect weapon. He knew it was a stopgap. He simply believed that a nation armed with 1 million clammy clams was far more dangerous to an invader than a nation waiting for a production line of anti-tank guns that wouldn't arrive for another year. The mandate transformed the sticky bomb from a rejected prototype into a physical manifestation of British stubbornness. The political battle had been won, but the physical challenge was just beginning. The bombs were now flowing to the front lines, which, in 1940, meant the gardens, hedgerows, and village squares of England. As crates of the No. 74 began arriving at local parish halls, the burden of Churchill's mandate fell onto the shoulders of ordinary civilians. The Home Guard was a patchwork force, retired Great War veterans, factory workers too young for the draft, and farmers who spent their days tending livestock. Now, they were expected to master a weapon that was essentially a glass ball of high-velocity liquid death. The training was less about marksmanship and more about surviving the weapon itself. Instructors, often as nervous as their pupils, hammered home a single terrifying rule. Once you take the wrapping off, the adhesive is active. Don't touch it. You stick that end on bad things, not yourself. The geometry of risk here was unlike any other infantry drill. Standard grenades were meant to be thrown, but the sticky bomb was designed to be placed. This required a volunteer to wait in a ditch until a multi-ton panzer was mere feet away, then stand up and physically slap the bomb onto the hull. Because the glass was fragile, a throw that was too hard might shatter the bottle before the fuse ran down. A throw that was too soft might see the bomb roll harmlessly off the sloped armor. The psychological toll was immense. Training videos from the era show men practicing with wooden dummies, but the transition to live explosives was a different reality. If a soldier's hand was sweaty or his sleeve was loose, the birdlime could snag. There are documented accounts of fumble drills where men had to be cut out of their coats after a sticky bomb refused to let go. This period of the war created a grim bond among these volunteers. They were essentially practicing a suicide mission. They understood that to use this weapon effectively, they had to be close enough to hear the German crew talking inside the tank. The sticky bomb demanded a level of intimacy with the enemy that bypassed traditional combat. It was a weapon that required the user to look death in the eye and hope the glue held. While the invasion of Britain never materialized, the Home Guard's mastery of the clammy clam wasn't in vain. The weapon was about to leave the English hedgerows for a very different, much hotter theatre of war. In February 1943, the geometry of desperation shifted from the humid fields of England to the scorched, rocky passes of Tunisia. The British Army was no longer the empty shell it had been in 1940, but it was facing a master of armoured manoeuvre, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the Afrika Korps punched a hole through Allied lines, threatening a total collapse of the front. The defence of the town of Thala became a desperate pivot point. A mixed force of British infantry and artillery was tasked with holding a ridge against a superior force of German panzers. As night fell and the dust of the desert choked the air, the traditional anti-tank guns were silenced by a relentless German barrage. The panzers began to crawl forward through the darkness, confident that no infantry could stop them in the open. At this moment, the sticky bomb was pulled from its crates by battle-hardened regulars of the 10th Royal Hussars and the 2nd Battalion, Hampshire Regiment. The desert night provided the perfect cover for the weapon's primary requirement: extreme proximity. One specific engagement at Thala remains a masterclass in the weapon's utility. As the German tanks attempted to bypass a roadblock, British soldiers slipped into the shadows, moving through the scrub like ghosts. One by one, soldiers emerged from the darkness, sprinting toward the clanking silhouettes of the tanks. The soldiers pulled the pins, jettisoning the metal covers, and slapped the glue-soaked bombs directly onto the engine decks and rear sprocket wheels of the panzers. In the chaos of the night, the German crews didn't even know they had been touched. Seconds later, a series of muffled crumps echoed across the ridge. The results were catastrophic for the German column. Because the bombs were stuck directly to the thin steel covering the engines, the blast didn't have to penetrate feet of frontal armor. It only had to breach an inch of steel to turn a million-mark war machine into a stationary torch. By the time the sun rose, the German advance had stalled. The clammy clam, the weapon that British generals had refused to touch with a barge pole, had just saved the line at Thala. To comprehend why a glass bottle of jelly could defeat a German panzer, we must look past the crude exterior at the physics of the explosion. The sticky bomb was an early unintended masterpiece in HESH, high-explosive squash-head principles. In a standard explosion, energy radiates outward in all directions, following the path of least resistance. If a grenade explodes next to a tank, most of the energy is wasted pushing against the air. To kill a tank with a small charge, you must ensure the energy is focused inward. This is the science of the stick. When the nitroglycerin gel in the number 74 detonated, the fact that it was coupled to the armor by the adhesive meant the shockwave traveled directly into the steel. This created the Hopkinson effect. The shockwave reached the inner surface of the armor plate and reflected backward. This tension caused a massive scab of steel, a jagged chunk of metal from the inside of the tank, to break off and ricochet through the interior at supersonic speeds. In other words, the tank was forced to attack its own crew. The technical geometry of the sticky bomb gave the infantry a specific set of targets: the engine deck, usually protected by only 20mm to 25mm of steel. A blast here would shatter the cooling fans and ignite the fuel lines. The drive sprocket. Sticking a bomb to the gears would snap the track, turning a mobile fortress into a stationary pillbox. The turret ring. If placed at the junction between the body and the turret, the explosion could jam the gears, rendering the tank's main gun useless. Another hidden advantage was the bomb's immunity to German countermeasures. As the war progressed, the Germans developed Zimmerit, a non-magnetic paste applied to their tanks to prevent Allied magnetic mines from sticking. Because Jeffries had used birdlime instead of magnets, the sticky bomb didn't care about Zimmerit. It stuck to the paste just as easily as it stuck to the steel. The sticky bomb was essentially a specialized tool for a high-stakes surgery. It allowed a single man to bypass hundreds of millimeters of frontal armor by focusing his attack on the armor gap. It was a weapon that traded range for lethality, forcing the soldier to become the guidance system. The engagement at Thala serves as the definitive receipt for the toy shop's most controversial invention. In that single chaotic night, British infantry credited the sticky bomb with disabling or destroying 6 German tanks. While half a dozen tanks might seem insignificant in a war of tens of thousands, the context of the engagement changes the math entirely. By knocking out the head of the spear, the British halted the momentum of an entire German column. Those 6 crumps in the dark saved the town of Thala and prevented Rommel from rolling up the Allied flank. The German response to the weapon was a mix of confusion and professional irritation. When German recovery teams examined the wrecks, they found the shattered remains of glass flasks and traces of a foul-smelling, sticky resin. Their intelligence reports described a crude, almost primitive adhesive device. They couldn't reconcile the technical sophistication of the British Empire with a weapon that looked like a homemade moonshine bottle. The statistics of the war eventually showed that the sticky bomb was one of the most cost-effective anti-tank measures ever deployed. For the price of a few shillings, the cost of a glass bottle, some wool, and a handful of gel, the British were deleting German assets worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. Furthermore, the stupid idea had achieved something the generals said was impossible. It gave the lone infantryman the confidence to stand his ground. The data proved that a soldier with a sticky bomb was 50% more likely to stay in his foxhole when a tank approached than a soldier with only a rifle. The weapon broke the tank's psychological aura of invincibility. The success at Thala acted as a shield for MD1, protecting it from further bureaucratic interference. The sticky bomb had done the unthinkable. It had moved from a ridiculous gimmick to a combat-proven asset. This validation allowed Churchill's toy shop to expand its operations, shifting from desperate improvisation to a sophisticated laboratory for irregular warfare. The sticky bomb effectively legitimized the concept of the armor gap, the idea that infantry didn't need to match a tank's power, only its ingenuity. This philosophy led directly to the development of the Piat, projector, infantry, anti-tank. While the Piat was a more conventional shaped charge launcher, it carried the DNA of the sticky bomb's mission, providing a single, unassisted soldier with the means to kill a heavy tank at close range. Strategically, the number 74 grenade changed the math of the battlefield. It forced German commanders to reconsider their tank doctrine. They could no longer assume that infantry without heavy guns were helpless. In the close quarters fighting of Italian villages and the dense hedgerows of Normandy, the threat of a sticky encounter forced German armor to stay at a distance, slowing their advance and making them vulnerable to Allied air power. By 1944, more sophisticated weapons eventually phased out the glass flask. The sticky bomb had a short shelf life. It was unstable in tropical heat and prone to leakage. Yet, its true impact wasn't in its longevity, but in the time it bought. It filled the gap between the total collapse of Dunkirk and the industrial recovery of the later war years. It proved that a nation's defense isn't just a matter of factory output, it's a matter of intellectual flexibility. The toy shop went on to create limpet mines for commandos and specialized demolition charges for the resistance, but the sticky bomb remained its most famous child. It was the first time the British military truly embraced the underdog's ingenuity, setting the stage for the specialized asymmetric warfare that would define the rest of the 20th century. The number 74 anti-tank grenade stands as a physical manifestation of a nation's refusal to surrender. It was a weapon that by all traditional military logic should never have existed. It was fragile, it was arguably suicidal for the user, and it was birthed in a country house rather than an ordnance factory. Yet, the legacy of the sticky bomb is found in the very survival of the British line. It was the definitive proof that ingenuity, when fueled by the geometry of desperation, is a force of nature. Major Millis Jefferies and the toy shop understood a truth that the generals had missed. When you are standing at the edge of an abyss, a flawed tool is infinitely more valuable than a perfect one that doesn't exist. We see the DNA of the sticky bomb in every modern asymmetric conflict. From the improvised explosive devices used by resistance movements to the specialized man-portable missiles of contemporary armies, the core principle remains the same. The goal is to empower the individual to stand against the machine. The sticky bomb was the first step in a long evolution toward the democratization of anti-tank warfare. The artifacts left in museums today, the yellowing glass spheres and the rusted metal clamshells, are no longer viewed as toys. They are recognized as the tangible evidence of a moment in history when a glass bottle was as important as a battleship. They remind us that the Atlantic was not just defended by a navy, but by the grit of civilians who were willing to carry a bomb that sticks to you into a ditch. In the end, the sticky bomb was never about the glue or the nitroglycerin. It was about the psychological shift of an entire people. It proved that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the sheer, stubborn will to find a solution when there is no hope left. The geometry of desperation had created a weapon that was a promise that the underdog would never go down without a fight.